The plane had landed 15 minutes early, the tarmac slick from a light rain that hadn't yet cleared the sky. The jet bridge hadn't even locked onto the aircraft door before the airline supervisor, clipboard in hand, motioned for the ground crew to pause. Something wasn't right. Down below, a military uniform caught her eye, not the kind you see every day in commercial terminals. A tall, solemn figure in dress blues stood beside the cargo bay, unmoving, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his cap. Next to him, a container wrapped in the American flag waited in silence. She stepped quickly toward him, glancing once more at the cargo manifest in her hand. It was standard to be notified of such transports, especially when an escort was involved, but the paperwork hadn't mentioned a dignified transfer. Her eyes met his, and he gave the briefest of nods. No words were exchanged at first. There didn't need to be. His presence carried a weight that silenced routine. "I wasn't told," she said quietly, heart already beating faster. "Orders came late." The soldier replied, voice flat, professional. "He's PFC Mason, 21 years old. We're bringing him home." The supervisor looked over her shoulder at the plane. Boarding was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. Baggage crew had started unloading standard luggage, and that would need to stop. She radioed for operations to delay cargo handling. No announcements were made, not yet, but already eyes were beginning to drift toward the windows as the personnel and high-visibility vests started to stand down. She walked with the escort toward the gate counter where 2 TSA agents had begun their shift. One of them raised a brow. "We've got a military transfer in progress, Flight 327. I need to halt processing until it's complete," the supervisor said. One of the TSA agents looked annoyed, the other simply nodded, already pushing his chair back. "Got it," he said. Then came the unexpected complication. The pilot for the outbound flight approached, a man in his late 50s with silver at his temples. "We're on a tight turnaround," he said. "Why's everything stopped?" The supervisor motioned toward the escort behind her. The pilot's eyes softened immediately, the creases on his face falling into a line of respectful quiet. "Understood," he said. "Say no more." But just as things were beginning to move toward a coordinated transfer, a mid-level operations manager stepped in, younger, flanked by urgency, headset crooked over his ear. "What's going on here? We're already 2 minutes behind schedule." The supervisor explained again calmly the situation. "There's no written order," the manager said, frowning. "I need confirmation before we hold up a flight for this." She looked at him hard. "He's here, the flag's there. We don't need a form to recognize what's happening." The manager hesitated, flicking his gaze from the uniformed escort to the nearby baggage cart with its cargo. Then he pulled out his phone, murmuring into it as he stepped aside. Moments passed. People at the gate were watching now, confused. Some stood near the window, squinting at the military man. Others looked at the frozen conveyor belts, the halted carts. The escort hadn't moved. His face remained unreadable, but his right hand tightened at his side, fingers curling once, then steadying again. The delay was not unfamiliar to him. Not all protocols run smoothly. Not all honors are automatic. Sometimes even silence has to be earned. The operations manager came back, looking sheepish. "Clear to proceed," he said. "Apologies." The supervisor didn't respond. She just gave a brief nod and turned to the escort. "You'll go through Gate C with the procession," she said. "I'll walk with you." They began moving, the terminal gradually quieting around them. The murmurs dimmed, and eyes followed them, the uniformed man, the wrapped casket on its cart, the quiet dignity of a moment that refused to be rushed. Somewhere, a child's voice started to ask a question. A mother hushed him, but not before others turned to listen. Something was building, not loud but deep. The hum of reverence, the weight of sacrifice beginning to register along the rows of departure seats and security lanes. And still, the soldier walked. A quiet tension settled over the terminal, the kind that seems to muffle footsteps and soften even the rustling of jackets. People near the windows, still holding their boarding passes and coffees, had started to piece together what they were seeing. The cart with the flag, draped casket was now in motion, led slowly by the uniformed escort, his posture straight as a line drawn by memory and duty. Beside him, the airport supervisor walked with measured steps, saying nothing, her eyes scanning ahead to ensure no interruptions. At Gate C, a gate agent quietly stepped away from the microphone and let the scene unfold without fanfare. The usual boarding chatter had faded. A few passengers who had been in line for Group A began to shuffle awkwardly, stepping aside, unsure whether they should stand or sit. One man removed his hat. A woman pressed her hand lightly to her chest, as if confirming the rhythm of her own heart. A family near the front, 2 kids, a young mother, and a grandfather in a wheelchair, turned fully toward the procession. The older man sat up straighter, his hands gripping the armrests. His face didn't change, but his eyes followed the movement with unwavering attention. His granddaughter reached for his hand not to comfort him, but because she felt it too. Something solemn, larger than a schedule, had just entered the space. A man in business attire looked up from his laptop and froze, fingers still hovering above the keyboard. Across from him, a teenage girl wearing headphones slowly removed them, her head tilting slightly as the energy around her shifted. People weren't being told to be quiet, they just were. The presence of that flag, the man beside it, the reverence in their pace it broadcast a message more powerfully than any intercom ever could. Near the back of the terminal, a group of young adults, probably college students judging by their sweatshirts, paused mid-conversation. One of them whispered something, and the others stopped laughing. They turned to watch, eyes wide. One of the girls crossed her arms tightly, a lump forming in her throat without warning. She didn't know the soldier's name. None of them did, but the weight of his sacrifice filled the space between strangers. A janitor paused, mop still in hand, and leaned gently against the handle as the procession passed. Behind him, a TSA agent lowered his gaze. Further along, a couple who had been arguing in hushed tones just minutes before now stood in silence, their previous tension dissolving into the stillness of shared observation. The airport had not issued an announcement. There were no bugles, no recorded taps, no flag ceremony on the PA, but something had shifted. Every breath drawn now felt just a little deeper. Every glance was heavier with meaning. Even the boarding signs, which kept flashing their automated messages, seemed out of place now, as though the usual rules of urgency no longer applied. As the escort walked with the casket, passengers began to step aside of their own accord, not because anyone told them to, but because they sensed that to continue as usual would be wrong. A woman in a pilot's uniform stood just outside the jetway and nodded solemnly as they passed. A young man, maybe no older than the soldier being escorted, blinked quickly and looked away, jaw tightening. Someone whispered, "Is that a fallen soldier?" And another voice answered softly, "Yes." No one asked for names. No one asked what had happened or where the flight had come from. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was going home, and the man walking with him was ensuring that his journey would not go unnoticed. The air felt different now, not colder, not warmer, just heavier with significance. It was as if time had slowed a little. Luggage wheels stopped rolling. Phones were held still. The casual, scattered noise of modern travel had given way to something reverent. The people in that terminal weren't linked by politics, beliefs, or destinations. But for a few minutes, they were united in a hush that said more than any tribute ever could. No one took a photo. Some instinct deeper than etiquette told them this moment wasn't meant to be captured, it was meant to be felt. And so they watched, bearing witness not just to a man in uniform, not just to a flag, but to the quiet power of sacrifice seen up close. Inside an airport terminal where the world had momentarily stopped to listen, the quiet was nearly complete, broken only by the low rumble of an arriving cart. The distance and the faint chime of a gate change announced 2 terminals over. The procession continued, slow and deliberate, the flag on the casket rippling gently in the soft current of the terminal's air system. Conversations had halted entirely now, replaced by the shared stillness of recognition. People didn't quite know where to look, their eyes flickering between the escort, the casket, and the floor. A small child, no older than 6, stood just beside one of the seats near the window. He had been coloring earlier, pages still spread across the little metal chair. His crayon was in his hand, blue, the tip pressed slightly into his palm as he looked toward the strange quiet spreading across the waiting area. He didn't understand it, not exactly, but he felt it. He tugged lightly on his mother's sleeve. "Why is everyone so quiet?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silence it seemed to echo, cutting gently through the air and landing on dozens of ears at once. Heads turned slightly. His mother looked down, unsure how to answer, her eyes misting as she swallowed. "That man is helping someone get home," she said softly, almost more to herself than to him. The boy frowned, puzzled. "Is it a hero?" he asked, and that word hero landed with weight far beyond its simple syllables. Some turned their heads fully now. A woman who had been scrolling absently through her phone lowered it slowly to her lap. A man in uniform, seated 3 rows back, blinked hard and adjusted the brim of his cap. Another woman, standing by the coffee kiosk, closed her hand around her cup a little tighter, her throat catching as she watched the boy lean against his mother's leg. The escort, hearing the boy's voice, did not look over, but his jaw tensed. He kept walking, his steps still perfectly measured, his grip on the cart unchanged. But something about the moment shifted in him, to a reminder that the young watch even when they don't yet understand, that memory begins in glimpses and questions. A few feet away, a teenager in headphones removed them entirely and set them in his lap. He looked at the boy, then at the casket, then at his own shoes. His hand clenched the armrest beside him. He didn't know this soldier, had never served, but something about the child's voice made him feel suddenly small, like a witness to something sacred. More passengers began to respond, though no one spoke. A man in a dark suit took off his sunglasses and bowed his head. A couple by the food court stood and faced the direction of the escort, the man pressing his hand to his heart. Even the airport staff nearby, usually so rushed and matter-of-fact, stood straighter, eyes forward still. The little boy looked around, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then he placed his crayon on the floor, very gently, as if even that sound might be too loud. His mother crouched beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Her other hand wiped away a tear, which she didn't explain. A veteran seated near the center of the waiting area, wearing a faded ball cap with the words "Vietnam Veteran" embroidered in yellow across the front, slowly pushed himself to his feet. His knees didn't move as easily as they once had, and he leaned heavily on a cane, but he stood. The motion caught the eye of a woman across the aisle, who rose too, not even realizing she had done it until she was upright. Within moments, more followed, not by instruction, not by cue, but by instinct. The child's question had reminded them of something they all carried quietly, some sense of duty or respect, or maybe grief. Maybe just gratitude. Row by row, seat by seat, travelers rose. Some bowed their heads, others placed hands over hearts. A few simply stood, silently watching, their faces caught somewhere between reverence and sorrow. The boy looked up at his mother again. "He is a hero," he said, with the simple conviction of a child who needed no further explanation. And his mother, with her hand still on his back, nodded, her face turned toward the casket as it passed, flanked by respect born not of command, but of shared humanity. The silence held. Row after row, passengers stood, many with hats now removed, some with eyes closed, others just staring forward, unmoving. The escort continued past them all, the flag, draped casket rolling slowly on the cart beside him. His uniform seemed sharper now in the overhead lighting, his posture somehow more rigid, as if every step carried the weight of 2 men, not one. The child's question still hung in the air, though no one spoke of it anymore. It had done something, sparked a stillness that turned solemnity into action. Among the quiet crowd, a man near the wall adjusted his grip on a worn leather bag and slowly stood. He had been seated alone, a little apart from the others, reading an old paperback with cracked edges. As he stood, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small square case. He opened it carefully and pinned a medal to his chest. Bronze star, aged but polished, glinting faintly beneath the terminal lights. Another man, watching from 2 seats over, caught the motion and stood too, offering a silent nod. He wore a navy cap with a faded insignia and scars on his knuckles that hadn't been made by accident. Without speaking, he moved to the edge of the walkway where the escort would soon pass. It happened in waves, like a tide rolling inward. Men and women, veterans by the look of them, rose. Some wore jackets that gave it away army green, Marine Corps insignia, patches from long ago conflicts. Others revealed their pass-through posture alone, shoulders squared instinctively, backs straightened as if in uniform once again. One by one, they stepped forward or to the side, creating a silent column on either side of the path. Not blocking, not interfering, just being there, present and proud. A man in his 60s stepped forward with a slight limp. He carried nothing, wore no identification of service, but stood at perfect attention, eyes locked ahead. His wife behind him put a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. She didn't stop him. He hadn't stood like that in years. The escort didn't glance at any of them directly, but something in his jaw loosened. His left hand relaxed slightly on the cart handle. The line of veterans forming around him was not expected. It wasn't organized, not official, but it was earned. It was understood without words, an unspoken code that did not fade with time, did not require uniform or command. The fallen would never walk alone, not in a place like this. Behind the veterans, other passengers followed suit. A teenage boy with a sports jersey rose awkwardly, unsure at first if he should join in. When he did, he took off his cap and looked down. A woman wearing scrubs, clearly an ER nurse on her way to a connecting flight, folded her hands in front of her and stared at the casket, her lips pressing into a firm line. A man in a pilot's uniform walked to the front of the gate and stood at attention, arms at his sides, eyes fixed on the flag. The airport around them kept functioning. Distant overhead calls for boarding could be heard, muffled now by the weight of the moment. A luggage cart rattled in another corridor, but in this terminal, on this path, a different kind of motion had taken over, slow, deliberate, sacred. A young woman with a baby on her hip rose and cradled the child against her shoulder. She didn't try to explain. She didn't need to. The baby looked over her shoulder, eyes wide and silent, sensing the quiet electricity in the air. Another child nearby watched the veterans with curiosity, clutching a toy truck in his small hands, forgetting to move it along the seat in front of him like he'd been doing for the past 20 minutes. As the escort neared the edge of the gate, the line of veterans extended all the way to the door. Not all had served with each other. Not all had seen combat. But they understood something others could only guess at: what it meant to return under a flag, what it meant to carry a brother home. Their eyes told the story. Not one of them looked away. Not one of them spoke. They simply stood, a living corridor of memory and respect. Unmoving as the soldier passed between them, the flight was delayed, though no one seemed to mind any more. The large screen above the gate still flashed the words, "Now boarding Group 1." But the announcement hadn't been repeated in nearly 15 minutes. No one stood in line. Not a single passenger approached the boarding door. The gate agent remained by her post, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes red but steady as she watched the last few moments of the escort's journey unfold. The casket had reached the entrance of the jet bridge, the place where the soldier would be taken aboard with honor and care. The escort paused, not for ceremony, but because the weight of the moment demanded it. The flag hung perfectly still over the casket now, untouched by any breeze. The veterans who had lined the terminal path stood motionless behind him, forming a corridor of memory and tribute that reached back through decades of service and silence. From the crowd came a voice, not loud but clear, singing the first soft lines of America the Beautiful. It was a woman standing near the center aisle of seats, her voice untrained but sincere. For a moment no one joined her, but then, slowly, another voice added harmony. A man 2 rows back, then a third. And within moments, a fragile, uneven chorus began to grow, voices of strangers rising into something gentle and raw. The singing wasn't rehearsed. It faltered in places, but it was real. People forgot the lyrics and hummed the parts they didn't know. Some sang with trembling voices, others with their heads bowed. A flight attendant behind the gate wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and joined in, her voice quiet but steady. Nearby, a father lifted his young daughter into his arms, whispering the words into her ear so she would understand why everyone around her had started to sing. Even those who didn't sing stood still, hands at their sides or clasped over hearts. A man with earbuds in removed them entirely, setting them down on his suitcase as if they didn't belong anymore. A woman wearing a business suit took off her heels and stood barefoot on the airport floor, holding them in one hand, her posture gentle, reverent. The song continued, thin but growing, spreading throughout the terminal like a thread being woven through strangers. At the edge of the jet bridge, the escort stood unmoving. His eyes remained fixed forward, his discipline intact, but something in his chest shifted as he heard the voices behind him. They weren't official, they weren't protocol, but they were somehow exactly what this moment needed. Not silence now, but the sound of a country remembering. The gate had transformed. It was no longer just a point of departure. It had become a place of communion between the fallen and the living, between strangers who suddenly shared something too heavy for words. The usual impatience, the scrolling of phones, the muttering about flight delays and cramped seats had all vanished. In their place stood something sacred, delicate, and unexpected. A young man in a hoodie and jeans removed his baseball cap and held it to his chest. He wasn't singing, his throat was too tight, but he kept his eyes on the flag and mouthed the words he remembered from grade school. Next to him, a woman closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She hadn't known what was happening at first. Now she didn't want it to end. The song faded gradually, not ending all at once, but in scattered notes and softened hums, voices falling away as emotion overtook melody. No one clapped, no one cheered, there were no calls for recognition, just a long, respectful pause that seemed to hold the very air in place, a kind of stillness that made time feel suspended. One of the veterans, the man with the navy cap, saluted. Not sharply, not with ceremony, but with a slow, precise motion full of gravity. Others followed, not all military, not all even sure how, but they did what felt right. A hand to the heart, a bowed head. A quiet nod that said, "I see you," without needing a single word. The escort gave the faintest signal, and the cart began to move again, wheels rolling softly over the polished floor toward the jet bridge. The airport, so often a place of hurry and detachment, had become a place of belonging, not because anyone planned it, but because, for a few minutes, a gate full of strangers chose to stop everything and remember together.